Recess had ended a few minutes ago, but the schoolyard still bore the hurried footsteps and remnants of childhood excitement. The wind blew uncomfortably, stirring up dry dust and carrying the scent of something no one seemed to notice, except for a single student who walked slowly, staring intently at the ground as if something had caught his attention in an almost invisible way. Among the scratches etched in the cement, a thin, dark, irregular mark traced a strange path, coming from the back of the school, passing by the playground equipment and ending in front of an ancient iron fence, forgotten by everyone, but at that moment, alive. He knelt without saying a word, as the sound of laughter in the background faded, as if time had stopped. His attentive gaze searched the iron structure until the unthinkable revealed itself. Something inside was moving, a whisper, a muffled sound, and then a hand, small, pale, trembling in the shafts of light escaping through the cracks. The boy didn't scream, didn't run. Instead, he stood and walked purposefully to the principal's office. Minutes later, patrol cars surrounded the school, security guards breaking through the gates, sirens echoing, teachers in shock, trying to understand what had been ignored for so long. The children huddled together, confused, as the hand calling for help finally reached them. And amidst it all, only one question seemed to make sense. How often does help pass before our eyes, but is only heard by those who learned too early to see what others prefer to pretend doesn't exist? If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like to follow the next stories that need to be heard. His name was Micah Brown, and at first glance, he seemed just another student among the many who filled the narrow hallways of Brooklyn Heights Elementary School. Thin, with a deep gaze and perpetually disheveled hair, Micah carried with him a silent presence that confused those around him. Many classmates called him strange, others simply ignored him, but there was something in his demeanor that set him apart. He didn't say much, but he observed everything, as if each detail were a piece of an invisible puzzle that only he was trying to piece together. Micah lived with his mother, Angela Brown, a nurse working grueling shifts at a local hospital. His mother's constant absence forced him to spend long hours alone, absorbed in his own reflections. In his room, a small desk was covered with scribbled pages of monsters, maps of places that existed only in his mind, and notes that revealed a meticulous understanding of the world. It was his refuge, a space where he could give form to the concerns he held within. At school, the reality was different. Micah didn't have many friends. He was often the butt of jokes, not because he was aggressive or clumsy, but precisely because he was too discreet. When everyone ran around the playground laughing loudly, he preferred to sit under the shade of a tree, observing the activity and mentally recording things no one noticed. The teacher who was always late with a coffee stain on his shirt, the staff member who hid her eyes red from crying, the classmate who kept candy in his backpack and pretended not to have any when asked. There was, however, a deeper wound in his life, his father's absence. Since he was little, Micah had asked who he was or why he'd left, but Angela always changed the subject with a forced smile. This absence had turned into a painful silence, which he carried like a constant shadow. Perhaps that was what gave him such a serious look for someone so young, as if he'd aged too quickly inside. But even with all this burden, there was something about Micah that couldn't be ignored. A quiet, almost imperceptible courage that emerged in the most unlikely moments. He never sought attention, but when he saw injustice, his heart beat differently, as if the instinct to act was stronger than any fear. And on that ordinary Monday morning, as laughter echoed through the hallways and the teachers organized their routine, Micah walked with his worn backpack on his back and his notebook clutched to his chest. To everyone, he was just another student lost in the crowd. But fate had already chosen that day he wouldn't be just a spectator. he would be the only one to notice something that everyone else would have missed. Because in the midst of the most mundane school routine, small signs would begin to reveal themselves to him. Signs so subtle that only someone like Micah would notice them. And these signs would be the first step on a journey that would put not only his life at risk, but also the fate of another innocent child. That morning's recess seemed like any other. Children scattered around the playground ran around laughing, playing ball or jostling for space on the rusty swings. Teachers chatted distractedly near the main entrance, and the sound of the bell that would echo in a few minutes seemed to be the only thing capable of organizing this childish chaos. But amidst this ordinary routine, something caught Micah's attention. As he walked alone near the gym, he noticed something unusual on the concrete floor. Small red stains, so subtle that anyone else would have walked right past them. His first impression was that someone had spilled paint, perhaps from some art supplies, but the coloring was unlike anything he was used to seeing at school. Slowly, bending down, he ran his fingertips over the stain. It was wet, sticky, and the metallic smell that wafted into his nostrils left no doubt. It wasn't paint. It was blood. The boy's heart raced. He looked around, expecting some reaction from the others, but no one seemed to notice. The children continued their games, oblivious to what was right before their eyes. Micah swallowed hard and continued his gaze forward. More drops were scattered in sequence, forming an irregular trail that snaked across the courtyard toward a more remote area, almost forgotten by the students. The old maintenance exit, where a rust-covered iron manhole once stood. Each step he took toward that spot made his breathing heavier. It was as if only he could see that something was deeply wrong. He tried to rationalize. Maybe an animal had been injured, maybe it was just an accident, nothing more. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about the silence in that corner of the school, a strange emptiness that contrasted with the din of children just a few meters away. He moved even closer and noticed the drops of blood growing thicker, almost forming small puddles near the grates of the manhole. He stood still for a moment, staring at the dark, breathing hole in the middle of the ground like an open mouth. The cold air escaping from it made his skin crawl, bringing a sense of foreboding that was hard to ignore. Micah couldn't explain why, but he sensed something, or someone was hiding inside. And as the distant sound of the bell echoed, calling everyone back to their classrooms, he stood before that manhole, hesitant, but certain that he had to find out what lay beyond that darkness. What he would find next would not only confirm his fears, but would completely change the course of that morning. Micah approached the manhole with slow steps, as if each movement were accompanied by an invisible weight on his shoulders. The rusted iron gave off a damp odor, and the darkness behind the grates seemed denser than it should have been. The boy crouched down, bracing one hand on the ground to maintain his balance, and leaned forward enough to see better. It was then that the sound cut through the air, a muffled, desperate noise that left no room for doubt. Someone was crying inside. He backed away instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. But his curiosity, and something deeper, almost a calling, pulled him back closer. His rapid breathing echoed inside his head as he drew closer again, and then, between the filthy bars of the manhole, a sight made him catch his breath. A small hand, trembling and bloodied, emerged from the darkness, as if struggling to reach the surface. Micah blinked several times, believing for a moment that his mind was playing tricks on him, but the fragile movement of those hands said otherwise. Blood dripped from the delicate fingers, and a hoarse, almost powerless moan confirmed that someone was trapped there. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. He moved a little closer and murmured almost in a whisper, "Hey, can you hear me?" From the other side, the answer came in a sob. Incomplete words, shot through with fear, but enough to chill her spine. "Help me. I can't get out. Micah felt his entire body shiver. He had never witnessed anything so real, so close to pure terror, his mind filled with questions. Who was that girl? How had she gotten there? Why hadn't anyone else noticed what was happening? He stood up suddenly, looking around as if expecting someone to run toward him, ready to confirm his discovery. But the courtyard was empty, silent after the bell that had led the children back to their classrooms. Only him, the drain, and the frail voice calling for help remained. An impulse seized Micah. He ran to the fence and tried to pull it with all the strength in his small arms, but the iron wouldn't budge an inch. His hands ached, his fingers slipped, and the noise echoed without anyone. Checking. Frustrated and with tears in his eyes, he backed away, pressing his hands to his chest. He didn't know what to do, but he was certain he couldn't ignore it. In that moment, Micah realized he held in his hands a truth no one else knew. A dangerous truth, but impossible to ignore. And even though he didn't yet know how to act, he was certain he needed to tell someone. The next step would be to seek help, but what happened next would test his courage in ways he never could have imagined. Micah ran down the hallway as if his life depended on it. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds, and his hands still trembled from touching the cold iron of the manhole. When he found the first teacher near the staff room, he barely managed to breathe before blurting out the words in despair. "There's someone stuck in the sewer. A girl. She's bleeding, I saw it." The teacher, a middle-aged woman with a hurried expression, looked up from a stack of papers and raised her eyebrows. For a moment, Micah thought he would be taken seriously, but her tight smile and indulgent tone were like knives. "Micah, you have a very vivid imagination. You must have seen a cat or some trash thrown there. Now go back to the living room. I don't want you running around the halls making things up." He opened his mouth to protest, but the teacher had already gone back to her work, as if nothing had happened. Micah's throat went dry. That feeling of helplessness burned inside. Determined, he ran to the principal's office. He knocked loudly on the door and entered, even without being called. The principal stood up, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose, and looked at the boy sternly. "What does this interruption mean?" Micah took a deep breath and recounted everything at once. The drops of blood, the bloody hand, the muffled screams. He expected any reaction, except for what he heard next. "Micah, we've already discussed your stories, haven't we?" The principal said, crossing his arms. "You scare your classmates with these fabrications, children disappearing in manholes? That's not healthy. Get back to class immediately, or I'll call your mother." Those words were like a crushing weight. The boy felt his face heat up, his throat burn. It wasn't a fabrication, it couldn't be. But no one believed it. In the hallway, some classmates who had overheard the conversation began to laugh, whispering among themselves. "Here comes the monster hunter." "Again. Micah, you need glasses. You saw marker ink and thought it was blood." He tried to ignore it, but the laughter echoed like invisible punches. Each laugh increased his frustration and loneliness. Even with the adults' indifference and his classmates' mockery, the image of that bloody hand wouldn't leave his mind. The girl was there, and he was the only one who knew it. If she didn't act, what would happen to her? The weight of this responsibility, greater than any child should bear, began to push him toward a dangerous decision. Micah knew no one would help him. If that girl's life depended on being heard, then all he could do was listen. But to move forward, he would need courage and the ability to see clues that everyone else insisted on ignoring. And while the last laughs of his colleagues still echoed behind him, Micah was already silently planning his next step, not realizing that the choice he would make next would lead him down a path of no return. Micah walked the halls in silence, the sound of his own footsteps echoing like a drumbeat inside his mind. The principal's words still reverberated, filled with contempt and distrust. But it didn't matter. He had seen, he had heard. A child was trapped down there, begging for help, and if no one believed him, he would have to find the truth on his own. After class, instead of following the other students to the main gate, Micah pretended to rummage through his backpack until the courtyard emptied. His heart was pounding, but his movements were calculated. He didn't want to be noticed. He knew any adult could send him home, or worse, call his mother. As the noise of voices faded, Micah discreetly made his way to the secluded area of the school, where the old maintenance building, which had been decommissioned for years, stood. The air there seemed heavier, as if carrying an ancient secret. The windows were covered in dust, the walls stained with age, and the rusty iron door still bore a broken chain. Micah pushed slowly, hearing the creak echo like a lament in the silence. Darkness filled his eyes, but he had prepared himself. From his backpack, he pulled a small flashlight he kept for the nights when his mother was late returning from the hospital. The beam of light swept across the dusty ground and soon revealed the first clues. There were fresh marks in the dust, large footprints, much larger than his own, mixed with scratches as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. Micah knelt and ran his fingers over the marks, recording every detail mentally, as he always did in his notebook. It wasn't imagination. Someone had been there, and not long ago. He walked slowly down the narrow hallway, shining his light into every corner. Among the old boxes and abandoned tools, he found a crumpled, red-stained piece of duct tape. His eyes widened. This was proof enough that something dark was afoot, but at the same time, it heightened the sense of danger. He felt watched, as if every footstep echoed louder than it should. In a corner, behind a toppled cabinet, was a half-open trapdoor. Micah swallowed and approached. The wood creaked, and the smell escaping was a mixture of mildew, rust, and something more metallic that he recognized immediately. Blood. He shone his light into the hole, but the darkness seemed to swallow the flashlight's light. From deeper inside came a distant noise, a muffled sound that might have been running water or breathing. Micah recoiled, his entire body racked with chills. His initial impulse was to run, but something inside him wouldn't allow it. If he left, he'd be condemning that girl to eternal silence. He had to keep going, even if his legs trembled and his mind begged him to give up. He pulled his notebook from his backpack and began feverishly jotting down blood trail, yard, manhole, duct tape, storage room, large footprints, trapdoor. Each written word strengthened his resolve. Micah had no proof to convince the adults. But if he accumulated evidence, sooner or later, someone would have to believe him. Suddenly, a click echoed through the building, as if a door had closed by itself. Micah froze. The beam of light trembled in his hand as he slowly turned. The hallway now seemed narrower, the air thicker. He wasn't alone. His heart raced, but his feet moved almost instinctively. He hid behind a stack of boxes, turning off his flashlight to avoid detection. Total darkness enveloped him, and each second felt like an eternity. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the air, approaching slowly and menacingly. Micah held his breath, his palm pressed to his mouth to keep from making a sound. He knew that if he were found, no one would ever know where he had disappeared. The figure walked down the hallway, dragging something on the floor, but seemed unaware of his presence. As the footsteps receded, Micah took another breath, his eyes watering with relief and fear. He knew he was in danger, but he also knew he was closer to the truth than ever. What he had just witnessed made it clear that someone was hiding secrets within that school. And if he were brave enough to continue, he would discover who it was and what was truly behind the mystery. Micah waited for long seconds, hidden behind the boxes, until silence once again fell over the maintenance building. His heart was still pounding, but curiosity and the responsibility he felt on his shoulders spoke louder than fear. When he was certain he was alone, he turned on the flashlight again and continued exploring the space. Each step was measured, each glance wary, but the need to piece together the puzzle drove him forward. In one of the rooms, he found torn cardboard boxes filled with the remains of broken school supplies. Among them was a children's backpack, too small to be a high school student's, but large enough to belong to a child the same size as the girl he'd seen in the sewer. The backpack was stained with dried blood, and inside were notebooks scribbled with colorful drawings interrupted by red smudges. Micah closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the urgency building. Beside the backpack, a stack of old newspapers stood out. They were copies of the Brooklyn Daily Post, yellowed with age but bearing disturbing headlines. Girl missing in neighborhood near school. Family searches for clues after mysterious disappearance. Authorities investigate unsolved kidnapping cases. Micah turned the pages with trembling hands. Realizing that these stories were no mere coincidence, they all had in common the disappearance of children from the region, and all were connected to nearby places. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't just a lost or injured girl. What he'd found was connected to a larger chain of events, a dark pattern no one seemed to have seen. Perhaps, he thought, someone within the school was involved. As he frantically scribbled in his notebook, the beam of his flashlight illuminated something behind. A stack of metal boxes, a narrow iron door, barely concealed by layers of dust. Micah approached and realized it wasn't locked. He pushed carefully, hearing the creak echo in the dark hallway. The passage led to a narrow tunnel, descending toward the school's basement. The air was damp, and the smell of rust mingled with the same metallic odor he'd smelled before. Following the tunnel, he found pieces of cut rope and red stains scattered across the walls. This wasn't just a hiding place. It looked like a place he'd used repeatedly. Micah ran his fingers over the marks and felt his entire body shiver. With each clue, each detail revealed, the certainty that someone was behind it all grew within him. And though he still didn't know who, a figure began to take shape in his thoughts. The janitor, always present, always walking the halls silently, always with access to places children weren't allowed to enter. Micah closed the notebook, clutching it to his chest. Now he had more than just conjectures. He had concrete evidence, but this also meant he was more exposed than ever. If he was right in his suspicions, this man wouldn't let him get away with this information easily. The sound of something metallic falling echoed in the tunnel, making Micah turn with a start. The beam of light swayed, revealing shadows that seemed to move. He took a deep breath, trying to control his panic, but he knew he couldn't stay there much longer. He had to get out, had to take what he'd discovered to someone who would believe him. The boy began walking back, his steps quick and silent, his notebook clutched tightly in his hands, as if it were his only weapon. But before he reached the exit, a strange sensation came over him. As if he were being watched, he stopped, his ears straining, his heart racing. He saw nothing, but he felt it. He was no longer alone in that tunnel. And with each passing second, the presence seemed to grow closer, as if someone was about to emerge from the darkness. The narrow tunnel seemed to close in on Micah, as if every damp, stained wall wanted to swallow him along with his secrets. The air was heavy, thick with dust and damp, and every breath seemed to echo too loudly, betraying his presence. He clutched the flashlight tightly, trying to hold it steady, but the light wavered, trembling in time with his sweaty hands. It was then that he heard it. Footsteps, slow, shuffling, heavy, reverberating against the concrete like a somber reminder that he was no longer alone. Micah froze, His heart pounded so hard he thought the sound could be heard from yards away. His first instinct was to turn off the flashlight, and total darkness fell over him like a suffocating blanket. Now there was only the sound of footsteps, growing closer, growing firmer. A metallic creak echoed, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. The boy slowly backed away, pressing his back against the cold wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. As the footsteps grew closer, a man's silhouette appeared in the tunnel, revealed only by the reflection of a small light he carried. His uniform was unmistakable: dark clothes, heavy boots, and a set of keys dangling from his waist. The janitor, the same man Micah had suspected, now there, in the same enclosed space, just a few feet away. The boy swallowed, his mind begging him to run, but his legs remained motionless, trapped by fear. The caretaker paused for a moment, tilting his head as if he'd sensed something strange in the air. He fell silent, simply listening, and Micah felt his eyes scanning the tunnel, searching for any sign of movement. The boy held his breath until his lungs burned, forcing himself not to make a sound. The silence between them was so thick it felt like screaming. Suddenly, the man grunted and continued walking, dragging a heavy sack that left dark trails on the ground. The metallic smell intensified, invading Micah's nostrils, and the conclusion was inescapable. That sack held something that shouldn't be there. Maybe it was garbage, maybe animal remains, or maybe something much worse. As the man passed, Micah moved slowly, trying to head in the opposite direction as quietly as possible. But as he misstepped on a loose rock, a sharp crack echoed through the tunnel, reverberating too loudly. The caretaker stopped immediately. Micah's heart raced. He knew he'd been reported. "Who's there?" The man's deep voice cut through the darkness, reverberating off the concrete. Micah felt his legs tremble, but he didn't respond. The voice repeated itself, more menacing. "I know there's someone here." The boy retreated further, hiding behind a concrete pillar. The janitor's flashlight flickered on, cutting through the darkness like a blade of light, sweeping down the tunnel toward him. Micah closed his eyes for a moment, silently praying he wouldn't be found. The beam of light grew dangerously close, gradually illuminating the walls and the floor until it almost touched his skin. He pressed the notebook to his chest as if it were a shield, sweat dripping down his forehead. At the last second, a distant noise came from the other side of the tunnel, perhaps a chain loosening on its own, or a pipe giving way under the weight of the humidity. The caretaker turned his attention away and headed in that direction, muttering incomprehensible words. Micah seized the moment to move, crawling along the ground until he reached the exit. His entire body was gripped by fear, but also by an almost supernatural determination. He couldn't stop now. He'd seen too much to pretend he didn't know. Emerging from the tunnel, he took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air rush through his lungs. But he knew this wasn't a victory. The man was still down there, and at any moment he might realize someone was investigating his secrets. Micah ran back to the warehouse, his heart pounding, each step echoing like a drum. He needed to find even stronger evidence, something impossible for any adult to deny. Only then would he have a chance of saving the girl who was still trapped. But at the same time, he knew he was now in real danger. The janitor wouldn't hesitate to silence him if he discovered that an 11-year-old boy was about to reveal his darkness to the world. And as Micah hid behind a stack of boxes to plan his next move, a disturbing question grew in his mind. How far would this man go to protect his secret? Micah emerged from the maintenance building, breathing heavily. The fresh morning air felt like a gift after so long suffocating in the tunnel, but there was no time to rest. He knew that if he didn't speak now, the girl would remain trapped in the depths of the school and might not survive much longer. The problem was, who would believe him? He'd been ridiculed before, called a liar, but this time he had more than words. Clutching tightly the torn backpack he'd found and the notes in his notebook, Micah ran toward the main gate. Police officers were still milling around, called to investigate the noises that had alarmed some neighbors. Two of them were talking near the entrance, and the boy, without a second thought, ran across the yard, stopping in front of them with a red face and trembling hands. "I know where she is," he said in a choked voice, hefting his backpack in front of them. "There's a girl stuck in the sewer. I saw her. I heard her screams. And it's not the first time. This man, the janitor, he's hiding children down there." The officers exchanged glances. The older officer, with a weary expression, seemed ready to dismiss him like everyone else. But when he opened the backpack and saw the unmistakable dark stains, his expression changed. The other officer picked up Micah's notebook, flipping through the pages filled with detailed notes, arrows, bloody sketches, and descriptions no boy would have invented on his own. The officer's silence was interrupted by the crackling of the radio clipped to their uniforms. "Possible suspicious activity reported near the maintenance building." The older officer stared at Micah, and for the first time, the boy felt like he was being taken seriously. "Show us," the police officer said firmly. Micah led them to the cordoned-off area, his short steps trying to keep up with the armed men's quick pace. Along the way, fear tightened his throat again. What if the caretaker was waiting? What if it was too late? But every beat of his heart also carried hope. For the first time, he wasn't alone. Reaching the manhole, Micah pointed to the rusted grate. The officers approached, shining powerful flashlights, and in the silence that followed, a muffled sound echoed from within. The faint cry of a child. It was the confirmation they needed. The radio crackled again, this time urgently. Reinforcements were called, sirens began to blare, and within minutes, the school was surrounded. Teachers, students, and onlookers crowded. Outside, not fully understanding what was happening. But Micah knew the truth, which everyone had ignored, was finally coming to light. The chaos turned into an explosion of voices, shouted orders, and intense movement. Armed police officers descended through the trapdoor, while others controlled the crowd. The school, previously indifferent to the boy who had always watched in silence, now looked at him with different eyes. But deep down, Micah knew the revelation was only the beginning. The true defining moment was yet to come, the moment when life and death would meet face to face, and where every second would matter. The sirens wailed around the school, police cars lined up outside the gates, officers ran with guns drawn and flashlights trained, and a sense of disbelief hung among the teachers and students who watched the scene from afar, unable to comprehend the gravity of what was happening. To Micah, each second felt like an eternity. He knew that down below, beneath the cold concrete, a girl was still fighting for her life. Two police officers used heavy tools to pry open the manhole grate. The iron creaked loudly before giving way, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel. Flashlights illuminated the interior, and what had previously been just a boy's testimony was now before everyone's eyes. The frail cry echoed once more, this time audible to everyone present. Teachers covered their mouths in shock, and a wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Micah watched closely, his heart racing. He wanted to get down, wanted to be the first to reach the girl, but he knew his part had been played. Now it was up to the adults to act. Still, he couldn't pull away. He was connected to that destiny in a way no one else understood. The operation was swift and precise. 3 police officers descended the tunnel, communicating over the radio in tense voices. Outside, everyone waited, listening attentively to every beep of the radio. Minutes later, the news broke the silence. "Found, alive, but very weak. We need paramedics now." The relief was immediate but short-lived. Another statement came soon after, charged with urgency. Suspect located in the west sector, attempted to flee. We need backup. The villain was no longer a hidden shadow. The janitor, finally exposed, tried to escape through the service corridors, but was cornered by the police. Shouts of order echoed, followed by running and metallic clangs. Tension gripped the school, and everyone wondered how a man who interacted with children daily had hidden such monstrous secrets for so long. Micah watched, his hands clenched against his chest. There was no joy in seeing the suspect led away in handcuffs. There was only a silent heaviness, the confirmation that everything he had felt and witnessed was real. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a boy making up stories. He was a silent hero who had seen what no one else dared to notice. When the police emerged from the tunnel carrying the girl in their arms, the crowd stirred. The small, frail body, wrapped in emergency blankets, was loaded into an ambulance. Her eyes were still half closed, but alive. Alive because an 11-year-old boy had refused to ignore the signs. The moment felt like the end of a nightmare, but for Micah, it wasn't just that. As he watched the paramedics work, he felt something was still missing. An explanation, an apologetic voice, an acknowledgement. Until then, no one had approached him to say, "You were right all along." He stood alone in the crowd, silently carrying both the weight of discovery and the scar of never being heard. And even at the height of the operation, one question lingered. What else could be hidden beneath that school? Had the girl been the only victim? Or was the mystery still far from being fully revealed? Days after the rescue, Brooklyn Heights School opened its gates again, but nothing seemed the same. The light atmosphere of recess had been replaced by suspicious glances, whispers in the hallways, and a silence that had never existed before. It was as if every wall held the memory of what had happened below. But there was one thing no one could deny. If it weren't for Micah Brown, everything would have ended in tragedy. That morning, the administration organized a small, impromptu ceremony in the auditorium. Teachers, parents, police officers, and even local journalists were present. Micah sat in the front row, hunched over, as if he didn't want to be there. He was used to being ignored, not the center of attention. His mother, Angela, stood beside him, holding his hand firmly, proud and moved. The police chief took the stage and, standing in front of the microphone, looked at the audience before saying the words that would finally give voice to what everyone knew. A few days ago, a terrible crime nearly took a child's life. But one boy's courage prevented it. Micah Brown not only saw what no one else saw, but he also persisted until he was heard. And for that, today, we recognize him as the true hero of this school and this community. The applause that followed echoed throughout the auditorium. Many who had previously been jeering now stood and applauded, some even with tears in their eyes. Angela wept uncontrollably with pride, hugging her son. Micah, however, didn't smile. His eyes remained downcast, and when he finally looked up, his expression was more of relief than happiness. When he was offered the floor, he walked timidly onto the stage. The microphone seemed enormous before him, but his voice, though low, echoed with sincerity. "I didn't want medals or applause. I just wish someone had listened to me sooner." The silence that followed was more eloquent than anything else. That sentence pierced the hearts of everyone in the auditorium because it spoke not only of a rescue, but of all the times a child is silenced, ignored, or disbelieved. Micah returned to his seat, his mother hugging him. For the first time, he wasn't completely alone. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't the end, because even amidst the recognition, something still whispered that the mystery wasn't entirely over. Night fell over Brooklyn Heights like a silent veil, bringing with it a sense of calm that seemed forced, almost artificial. The streets around the school were still marked by police presence, with yellow tape flapping in the wind and curious looks from neighbors trying to comprehend the scale of what had happened. But in the small room of a simple house, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, Micah Brown remained awake, sitting at the window overlooking the deserted street. His eyes reflected not only the weariness of everything he'd experienced, but also a shadow of doubt that refused to dissipate. No matter how many lives he'd saved, no matter how much applause he'd received, there was a voice inside him whispering softly, reminding him that this wasn't the end. Secrets don't disappear so quickly. Shadows aren't erased by sirens. As he stared at the sidewalk, wet from the light drizzle that fell that night, something caught his eye. Micah squinted, trying to make out what he saw, and felt his heart pound. There, near the corner drain, small dark drops were slowly running down, mixing with the rainwater. He couldn't immediately make them out, but he recognized that tone, that imagined smell, that memory etched on his skin. Blood. His breathing quickened. His entire body shivered as if he were facing the same dark tunnel again. Was someone else in danger, or was the nightmare not over yet? The feeling that he was facing something greater, something just beginning to be revealed, took over his mind. Micah slowly moved away from the window, but his eyes remained fixed on that nearly invisible speck. The silence of the room contrasted with the storm brewing inside. He didn't want to believe everything was starting over, but he knew deep down that some stories never truly close. They just wait for the next chapter to fully unfold. And so, the narrative's imaginary camera slowly moves away, showing the boy standing in front of the window, the sleeping city in the background, and on the sidewalk, the red drops that insist on not disappearing. He was just a boy, but he changed the destiny of an entire city. If you've made it this far, and this story has captivated you from beginning to end, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next exciting stories. Activate the bell, like, and share this video, because with each new episode, you'll discover that even the smallest heroes carry within them the courage capable of transforming the world.